Professor Clowney, who many of you know. David Clowney has his PhD from Temple University, has been teaching at Rowan since 1988, is a full professor of philosophy and a very distinguished member of our department, and indeed a very beloved member of our department. He teaches ethics, environmental philosophy, aesthetics, and logic here, and is working on, and the presentation that he's going to give today is part of a larger project entitled The Way We Are, Collective Character and Environmental Crisis. In fact, he's given many chapters of this now in the series. Today he's going to speak to us on the topic of what is environmental justice, and I'd like to encourage all of you to join me in welcoming Professor David Clowney.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad to see so many of you here. Not just because I'm glad that people are coming to hear me talk. I hope I don't disappoint you, but that there's this much interest on campus on this particular topic, because I think this is the fullest room that we've had in the series this year so far. And that I find to be encouraging, not because it's me, but because it's something about the environment and justice, which is a pretty important thing. And I want to start by getting a feel for the room by asking you, first of all, if you know what the graffiti mean. Yeah?
No Dakota Access Pipeline.
No Dakota Access Pipeline, yes. A very current issue in environmental justice in this country. The other question I want to ask you is, what's your answer to my title? What do you think environmental justice is? Or how many people are pretty familiar with that term, and you've got a pretty clear notion of at least the center of what it refers to? Stick your hand up. Okay.
A lot to teach today, don't you?
Yeah. So this talk is going to proceed somewhat like throwing a stone into a pond, and then ripples go out from there. And then it's going to turn out there's other ponds or other stones in the pond, and they're starting to intersect the different ripples. Because on the poster, there were questions about, are there rights for is there justice for animals, justice for the planet? What is environmental justice after all? Justice for the environment or whatever? And I want to say, to start out with, that environmental justice is originally a term that originated in the United States in the 1980s in connection with the other term, environmental racism. And it's very, very specific in that context. It's really about things like this. Environmental racism in the United States. Here in October 1982, folks are marching to protest citing a toxic waste dump in mostly poor, black Warren County, North Carolina. And it's these protests in the 1980s that started the environmental justice movement in the United States. And the justice that is in question there is basically a justice issue about what's up with all of you people getting all the benefits of the environment, of using the environment up, and we get all the trash. And guess who gets it? And we'll talk more about that later, but it's pretty obvious. Mostly people of color, mostly poor people, and very specifically, mostly African Americans. This title, this name of environmental racism, was apparently originated by Dr. Benjamin Chavez, who at the time that he originated it was chair of the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice in 1981. And he defined environmental racism as racial discrimination in the deliberate targeting of ethnic and minority communities for exposure to toxic and hazardous waste sites and facilities, coupled with the systematic exclusion of minorities in environmental policy making, enforcement, and remediation. So there's a couple different things going on there in that definition. He's a very thoughtful and brilliant man. And you'll notice that he's talking, first of all, about a disconnect between who gets the waste, right, and those who benefit, and the exclusion of minorities in making in having any power in making decisions about where waste sites are located, or in decisions about the remediation of them. So those themes are all going to keep showing up here. So these are structures and practices that shift environmental costs to the poorest and the least powerful, specifically to communities of color, while distributing their benefits to wealthier white communities. For example, waste disposal sites, power plants, polluting industries, highway construction, beachfront development. And this racism is almost always institutional more than individual. This is not to say that there's no individual racism involved, that there aren't people making decisions who are very happy to shift the burden and the problems to black people because they don't count. There's a lot of that going on, and there's a lot of that in all of us way down deep where we're not even aware of it. And social psychology experiments have shown this and done sort of devastating experiments on it. I won't get into that. All of us have the job of hauling that stuff out into the daylight and putting a stake through its heart whenever we get the chance to do it. But institutional racism is not primarily some aggregation of a lot of psychological racism. It's structural. The background and we'll talk more about that in a minute, but the background for the environmental justice movement is the civil rights movement, and I've got a whole bunch of dates here, which I will not bother to read through, but major events just highlighting the fact that the civil rights movement is a grassroots movement from the ground up, and that there were many deaths involved and a hard, long struggle. And the environmental justice movement is a continuation of that. It's a recognition that not only in housing and in economics and in access to schools and to good food and to clean water and all the rest of it, but in terms of just living in an environment that was healthy and safe, African Americans in particular, people of color in general, poor people, get the short end of the stick. And the other background for the environmental justice movement is American environmentalism. And then more broadly, as we'll see, global environmentalism, which is a little bit different. And part of the question about the one of the important things about the environmental justice movement, as you see its history, is the way it comes into contact with the big green, the big American environmental movement. And there's a lot of, some of the philosophy in this talk ends up getting generated by some of the discussions between the environmental justice movement and American environmentalism, because they start in rather different places. But I will keep going here. You'll notice here that we have an EPA definition of environmental justice. That's something, isn't it? Particularly in view of the fact that the current head of the EPA was hired basically to destroy it, and that the environmental justice subcommittee or group within the EPA was about to get just canceled And now instead it's being brought under Scott Pruitt's oversight, which may even be worse. It's hard to tell. But how did this show up? It showed up because of environmental justice activism by Ben Chavez and Robert Bullard and many other African-American environmental justice leaders who put it to President Clinton, and after some pressure, there was an act or what do you call them again? I just forgot. Presidential executive action that Clinton passed or promulgated. And this created this subdivision of the EPA. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. The EPA has this goal for all communities and persons across this nation. It will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards, and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. That's a pretty great statement. And Clinton didn't write it. I'm pretty sure that Ben Chavez wrote it. And Clinton signed it into law. So we have that structure in the United States, and there is a legal appeal that can be made to that regulation. So some progress made here. The movement, as I said, is a continuation of the civil rights movement. It starts with concern for unjust dumping of toxic waste and siting of chemical plants, and I'll give you some stats on that in a minute. It expands to include community development, such as, for example, Sustainable South Bronx with Majora Carter. I'll come back to her a little bit later, too. But all across the country, there are grassroots activities in wasted urban areas and sometimes in rural areas as well by poor communities and communities of color, taking their communities back and rebuilding them in ways that are environmentally aware. As it grows, the movement allies pretty quickly. It's less than 10 years from its beginning when you get an alliance with the First Peoples in the United States, the indigenous peoples. And so resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline comes in as part of the American environmental justice movement, where they're talking to each other, these various groups within the movement. And the first resolution that is passed by the environmental justice leadership group, or they have a conference in 1990, and in the principles of environmental justice, they lay out the first principle is, I'll skip the preface, but the first principle is environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. That's quite a journey to that statement from the initial protests against what are you dumping in our backyard. What they were dumping in that picture I showed you was a whole bunch of PCBs that had been dumped along the roads in North Carolina, and then the state had to clean it up. And they decided to dump it all in a big mountain in this black neighborhood. That's what the protests were about. And unfortunately, they didn't win on that one. But there's that very specific, what are you doing putting it in our backyard? To here, which it's got a lot more sort of worldview, philosophy, larger picture going on, right? And it's obviously though I haven't done the research to track it all down. But it's obviously partly because of joining up with Native Americans, the First Peoples, who are going to really be talking about sacredness of Mother Earth, interdependence of species, and so on. And so it's headed in the direction of some of the themes that are actually picked up in American environmentalism, and preparing for some coming together of those two movements. And it's really important to see that it's a resistance to institutional environmental racism, regardless of intent. And Robert Bullard, in his book, Dumping in Dixie, is one of the first books about environmental justice, and Professor Damon Miller here on campus studied with Robert Bullard, is really, good friends with him, and he's known as the father of environmental justice. But he says it's really hard to prove intent, and it shouldn't have to. If a practice ends up disadvantaging a particular race on a regular basis, it's racist. End of story. Close the book, move on, do something about it. And then we can talk, and this is part of what my book is about, in what sense are these racist or anti-environmental or unjust structures or harmful structures that we belong to, in what sense are they ours? In what sense do we have responsibility for them? In what sense does it make sense for us to either be proud of what our groups do or ashamed of what they do? And I won't get into that too much here, but you can see that showing its slip here in this issue right away. And I'll come back to it at the end of the talk. To talk first about institutional and individual racism, I just have to give a nod to Kwame Ture, or originally Stokely Carmichael, and he was very happy to go by either name, though he adopted Kwame Ture. But he and Charles Hamilton define institutional racism by saying it's less overt than individual racism, it's far more subtle, it's less identifiable in terms of specific individuals committing the acts, but it's no less destructive of human life. It originates in the operation of established and respected forces in the society, and thus receives far less public condemnation than the first type. And so, there's nobody to blame, but it happens. I was just reading in the New York Times this morning about its problems with its public transportation system and about how long it takes to get to work. Guess whose trip to work is the longest? Black people and with low salaries, 25% longer trip to work than white people. Probably even independent of salary. That's institutional racism. It's completely irrelevant to say, yeah, it's not my fault. No, we didn't do anything. Yes, in a sense, we together did. And that's the issue. How do we address problems of that sort? So back now to environmental justice and environmental racism in the United States, just a little bit more of a survey. The general picture, it's from NIMBY to PIBY, not in my backyard, to put it in black people's backyard. And that is a, let me give you one example of how that works. This is the Louisiana Energy Services and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission deciding on how to site a uranium enrichment plant. Anything to do with uranium is bad news for anybody anywhere near the neighborhood. And there's all sorts of evidence for that. Well, how do you decide where you're going to put it? There's an objective scientific process for the siting. That's what's claimed. And here you go. Look at the African American population of the whole country, 13% at the time that Bullard wrote it. In the South, 20%. Louisiana, 31%. Northern Louisiana, 35%. Claiborne Parish, where the site, where they finally decided they wanted to put it, 46%. Zoom, 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 zeroing in on that population. And even more obviously, of the all the sites that were seriously considered, 78 sites in 16 Louisiana parishes, 28.35% black in 1 mile radius, and you can see the stats. The first cut, 37 sites in 9 parishes, percentage goes up to 36.78% black. Then cut to 6, now it's 64.74% black. Final choice, Lesage, 97.10% black. Might be a couple of white people that would get hurt, but basically it's all them. And yet this is presented as an objective scientific process. And a couple of the neighborhoods don't even get mentioned in the studies because they're not incorporated. It took 8 years of a lawsuit, and the environmental justice forces won on that one. The plant did not get sited there. Most of the time, unfortunately, they've lost. I could give you a whole bunch more examples, but if I spend too much time on them, I won't get to the philosophy. So it's just that pattern is replicated again and again and again and again and again. And that systematically, and it doesn't even depend on income, African Americans are far more likely to be living in an area that is some sort of toxic waste dump, chemical plant, or other, dangerous thing. Is that relevant now? Yeah, absolutely. Puerto Rico is an obvious example of environmental injustice going on right now, and it's so blatant. And if you study the history of Puerto Rico, it's even worse, because we have been raping that territory for at least 100 years. And that's why it's in such horrible financial shape. And we set up laws that sort of encouraged corruption amongst the local leadership, and now we blame them. And how long has it taken for us to get any kind of realistic help to them? Oh, they're on an island. Never mind, don't get me started. The Dakota Access Pipeline, the Keystone Pipeline, post-Katrina New Orleans, post-Harvey Houston, childhood asthma in Philadelphia, that guy and his crew going to Bonn to say, oh, coal, gas, fossil fuels, we still need them. Hey, here's how to do it right. And notice that it's hosted by Fiji. This is the 23rd Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Pact about climate and the environment. Here's this drowning island in the Pacific, and they don't have room for everybody to come, but they hosted the conference in Bonn. So environmental injustice goes global, and it also extends into the future. And for current relevance, I'm just going to click on this and hope it works. Maybe it won't, maybe it will. But this is a link to our Children's Trust, which I don't know if you're familiar with this lawsuit, but it's starting up. Oral arguments begin in about a week. I think it's December 11th in Oregon. And it's a suit by children and teenagers against the government for not acting on climate change. It was against the government, and the fossil fuel companies had joined the suit. They've pulled out. And the Trump administration has been trying to block the suit as frivolous or whatever else. And so far, that has not been permitted. and the arguments will go forward. And the basis is we have a common claim, and the government has the business to protect it, to being able to have a decent environment to live in. Goes way back to Roman law. So just some contemporary relevance of this issue. Well, I won't stop at this either, but this is a guy who just left the EPA because he says Trump's war on the environment is a civil rights emergency. And he's coming back to the very questions about environmental justice that we've just been talking about, that all of the protections that have been hard fought for are being pulled away as regulations that get in the way of business, and everybody needs business in order to have jobs. So that's why it's populist. Well, you're familiar with this. Environmental justice expands. I picked two very photogenic people. I should have had Robert Bullard up there too, and a couple of others. But Majora Carter is the woman who started Sustainable South Bronx. And you should watch her TED Talks. They will really get you going. She's amazing. And she's transformed that neighborhood from pretty much of a wreck to a community that is really standing on its own feet, and with environmental principles and justice principles and get your trash out of our backyards principles all going at the same time. Naomi Klein has many wonderful books. The most recent one, No is Not Enough, Resisting Trump Shock Politics and Winning the World We Need. And she's all about justice, and mainly about how it has to start from the grassroots and the ground up. But of course you have to deal with structures as well. Let me keep moving along here, because I want to, maybe I should go back one slide. I just want to mention that there was a presentation at the United Nations in 1999, and this is Margie Richard, who lived next to the Shell refinery in Norco, Louisiana. The link here, which I won't link onto, is a little video of the explosion of the Shell refinery that they live right next door to. Shell bought up this community and then parked a whole bunch of refineries around it. And this is the same Shell that does this in Nigeria. And this, and this, and this. And here's someone protesting it. And Shell didn't do it themselves. It was the government that did it on their behalf. Murdered Ken Saro-Wiwa, I think I have the name right, and several of his collaborators who were protesting against what Shell was doing. So it's not just, some nasty stuff in your backyard. It's murder. Sometimes quick murder and not just slow murder. Now, as environmental justice expands, it comes into contact with environmentalism in the rest of the world, which is kind of different from American environmentalism, particularly if you go to the global south, to India, to Brazil, to places like that. And this is Ramachandra Guha, who is an environmental historian and an academic. He's lots of things. He's an amazing guy. His Environmentalism, A Global History, is short, easy to read, and tells you a whole lot and gives you a picture of environmentalism around the world and not just in the United States. And this is him when he comes to Yale in the 1970s. He says, as an Indian, I imagined environmentalism as a question of social justice, allowing the poor as much claim on the fruits of the earth as the powerful. Right? And he says, I found a different environmentalism that focused attention away from humans toward the rights of plants, animals, and wild habitats in the United States. So, American environmentalism, emphasis on wilderness, on biodiversity loss, on species preservation, and also on global issues. Guha ends up trying to put these things together. The environmentalism of the poor is what he calls the environmentalism around the world, especially in the global south, because throwing off colonial rule didn't get rid of industrialization in developing countries. It continued, and now you've got the elite within the former colony basically running the same program. And then you get resistance within the Chipko and Chico, that's in India and in Brazil. The Chipko movement is the movement of women in the village of Mandel, and then they inspired many others, and they just went and hugged the trees that the loggers were going to cut down. Now, the trees were in the forest owned by the government. It was a state forest, and the village was right next to it. But the people would go into the forest, and they would collect things that sustained their livelihood, and the government sold the rights to a sports company to, make something or other out of the wood, and the villagers said, no, you're destroying our life, and they hugged the trees. And there was a lot of campaign of that kind of resistance to Western maldevelopment. In Brazil, Chico Mendes, a labor organizer who promoted the ecology of justice, and there, again, you've got people putting their hands around, linking arms around a forest to keep it from being logged because they lived from the forest, and instead, people wanted to come in and cut it down and have ranches that would last about 5 years because the soil was too poor to sustain them, and devastate the rainforest. So that's the environmentalism of the poor. It comes from the bottom up, and it's you can see what's in common between them. This is the pattern that Guha talks about: development, then degradation, then shortages, protest, local controversy, national controversy. Okay, you can see what's there. We can talk about the connection between environmental justice and the environmentalism of the poor. That's obvious, and there's alliances that are being made. And then there's the question of connection with American environmentalism. In 1990, the environmental justice movement wrote letters to Big Green saying, you guys are racist and elitist, and you ought to do something about it. Your staff is whiter than most government agencies and most corporations, and you're making decisions on our behalf without coming and talking to us. We need to do something different. And that is still being worked out. I want to jump to philosophical issues of justice that show up in this context. And I thought the context was important, so I've given you a lot of it. And this is new stuff, so it's not as well organized as it might have been in terms of getting it done quickly. Philosophers have been talking about justice forever, which means that there's probably something to talk about, something to puzzle about. I'll give you a couple of real quick things. Aristotle talks about general justice and special justice, and general justice is just conformity to the moral law, or rather just to the law, because he thinks the law, by good lawgivers, would be made right to make people good. And that's the same sense that you get the same word related to justice in the New Testament. When you hear talk about righteousness, it's just, doing the right thing. But that's not the main use of justice here. Justice here is something much more special. It's about fairness. It's about, giving people equal amounts of things if no one has a special right to a particular larger amount of it. It's about having people bear the cost of the benefits that they get rather than shoving the cost off to somebody else. It's about corrective justice and distributive justice and protective justice, about protecting people's rights. And obviously there's some unfairness going on, and in not just unfairness but murder. And you would say that, of course we ought to correct it, but the sense that there's something wrong isn't enough to get us doing much. The first environmental conference in Stockholm in 1972, Brazil and India were saying, it's our turn, and we should be able to burn coal and oil as much as we want to catch up because you guys are way ahead of us. And it's unfair for you to say, oh, now you've got all the benefits and now we're not allowed to grow because the planet can't afford it. And that's still a problem about the rich nations and the poor nations, the northern nations and the southern nations, and how the justice of that is to be worked out. The northern nations haven't been willing to reach very far toward the south, and we haven't been willing to restrict our waste production and greenhouse gas production very much, especially not in the United States. Could we? Yeah, we could. It's technically possible, and I won't go into trying to show that, but I assure you that it's true. But there's these obstacles. There's the political impossibility, and it really takes big structural changes, I think, in the way we run things to be able to make the technological changes and the changes in our way of life that are necessary. And that won't happen without support from the ground up. So it's always got to be something coming from the bottom and something coming down from the top at the same time, somehow. But the other obstacle is that there's no agreement on the values that should guide the change. And that's what makes it really hard to know what changes should really be made. Now there's agreement on some values, I would say. I think that second question is more important because in the end politicians listen to their constituents, so if the constituents have the values and say this is what we insist on, then eventually people will be, it is to be hoped at least, that the politicians might fall in line. Environmentalists, especially Big Green in the States and around the world, tend to propose new value systems. Ecocentric instead of anthropocentric, deep ecology, and so on, and to try to get everybody on board with them. And one of the things that I've come to in working on this book is that I think that's a big mistake. And I'm much more inclined toward the sort of philosophical pragmatist approach of letting values battle it out, and to think about a kind of ecology of values and worldviews in the service of environmental justice. Because it's often possible, if you don't insist on somebody changing their very foundations, to reach agreement on particular things. I think that it's possible here. So here's some things I think that we would probably all agree on. Justice is a social notion. It's about how we treat each other. It's got something to do with equality, which we just talked about. But then, equality of who? Who's in the reference group? Who counts? And current attitudes toward refugees replicate in-group, out-group dynamics from throughout human history. They don't count. And I've got lots of examples of it, but the two I picked right here, Icelandic mothers and Poughkeepsie anti-immigrant residents, span a nice bit of history. The Icelandic Sagas are wonderful reading in English translation. I read a whole bunch of them a couple summers ago. And the Icelandic society was very admirable in so many ways, very democratic, very non-misogynistic. Women had great power and authority, and they had good ways of settling things, and Icelandic mothers would scorn their sons if they weren't ready to just go out robbing, raping, and pillaging on summer raiding journeys and bringing home some slaves. You know, in group and out group. And in Poughkeepsie, just recently, and I just heard this on NPR the other day, this is about, you know, immigrants, and some folks were trying to settle some immigrants in Poughkeepsie. And you heard the residents of Poughkeepsie saying, you know, why here? There are people here that don't have jobs. Why should we be bringing other people here to seek jobs? We need help here. Why should we be helping these other people? In group and out group. And that's something that needs to be dealt with. I'm not sure that it's so much of a philosophical issue as it is something for all of us to reflect on. How do you get past that? And it can be done, I think. But I think it always happens in face-to-face relationships where you suddenly come to see the person as someone like you, which again goes to grassroots from the ground up. The question here is E.O. Wilson right? Do we as human beings need an outgroup who doesn't deserve justice? E.O. Wilson is a famous biologist and you know, father of social biology, and he that's the wrong term, but you know what I mean. He says in a recent book that we're just wired this way. We're always going to have an outgroup. We can expand our in-group, but there's always got to be somebody else that is our enemy that we're opposed to. I would like to think that's not true. But it's sort of like Plato's view of democracy and the republic. The challenge is to prove that he's wrong by acting differently. Because it's kind of plausible. So how big must the circle get if we were really going to do it the right way? And let's talk about that, and that'll probably wind things up. All human beings? By now, I think everybody at least gives lip service to that, even though, in fact, we don't act like it at all. Future generations. Yeah, but how do they get a voice since they're not here yet? And who's going to stand up for them? And by the way, how can we owe anything to them when if we do some of the things we think we ought to do to protect them, they won't be here? Different people will be here. We won't have as many kids, so there's some of those people that would be suffering from an overcrowded planet who won't be here. And there's a philosopher, Derek Parfit, who's gotten a lot of mileage out of this. What he says we ought to do about that problem is lie to people about it, because we know what they ought to do, and if we tell them that, they won't do it. I think there are other solutions that are better than that. And I think one of them is just simply to think collectively. We can be concerned in general about the human beings, whoever they are, that will be here later, and make actions in favor of promoting, you know, the continued flourishing of humanity in the way that we would like it to be, with all those compromises about values. How do you care about future generations? I've got two examples here. Our Children's Trust lawsuit is one of them. Go check out the website and see what it's about. And then a Joanna Macy exercise that I was part of a little while ago at a conference, where two circles facing each other, and the person across from you was either several generations ahead of you or several generations behind you. So you were the future talking to the past, or you were the past talking to the future. And I was just stunned by what that did to me, to be talking to a descendant of mine, or to be a descendant of someone else, saying, you know, here's what you did and why. but especially, talking to a real person as if that person were my several generations forward descendant. I think there are lots of ways of coming to care about the future. But then these other questions come up. Do we owe something to animals? Do we owe something to the planet? And these notions are starting to come into law now. In Spain, and I forget which other country it is, maybe Argentina, maybe Ecuador, maybe another Latin American country, great apes and cetaceans now have certain rights as persons. I think you can make a real good case for that. In the Ecuadorian constitution, the earth has rights, and people can bring lawsuits on behalf of the earth. But what I want to say here is, and this I will wind up with, this is my philosophical point. I'll just sort of toss it out to you and see what you make of it. How you're going to bring in other animals, plants, and the ecosystem, which we must bring into consideration if we're going to have any chance of leaving a decent life for future human beings. It depends on your worldview. And I think that if your goal is to try to change everybody's worldview to the one that you think will work, that's a recipe for failure. It's not going to happen. If you think, patriarchal monotheism is misogynistic and disastrous, and we need to get rid of it, I'm sorry. You're just not going to you're just not going to convert all the Christians and Jews and Muslims in the world and shift them over to following Starhawk. It won't happen.
Really?
And, a lot of those other things, you're not going to make everybody into a secular humanist. And you're not going to all of a sudden, convert the secular humanists to Franciscan Christianity either. And I suggest that you don't have to. Instead, you can have an ecology of worldviews, because you can come to a healthy environmentalism from within all those traditions that I just mentioned. And if you doubt me, then just go study them and look for the environmentalism that comes from them, or look at least with the religions, Mary Evelyn Tucker's many-volume collection of from Harvard University Press about environmentalism in these different religious traditions. And so I think it's really like pluralist democracy. There is no formula. Rawls is nuts. There is no neutral public reason. All there is, but it can be made to work, is a set of rolling compromises with human beings facing each other and recognizing in the face of the other somebody that we have to respect and reach out to and have some empathy with. And then find ways we can figure out to do a thing together that we find we both care about. And if it turns out that some of the people want to save the wilderness because they want to hunt, and others because they want to save the animals, maybe they can still cooperate on some rules that save the wilderness. And if it turns out that some people want to get the garbage out of their backyard because it's killing their kids, and other people want to get it out because it's killing future generations on the other side of the planet, hopefully they could both care about both of those things. But if, different main motivations, common action. And that only happens from the grassroots up. This has been not as well organized a talk as I would have liked it to have been, but I hope that it has been interesting and helpful, and I will stop now and take questions. You go ahead, moderate. Yeah.
All right, so you stand there and I'll moderate. So.
Yeah.
I can kind of understand just that point you made at the end about essentially ecologies of views, how you can build like politically active coalitions around people who don't have necessarily entirely coherent sets of values. But it seems like there has to be like some lines to the coalition at which there's like certain views which simply just could never be incorporated. Like if I imagine like somebody who's just around and like is entirely unconvinced there is an environmental problem, or thinks we can just go like rip it on the coal and the uranium and just keep going and going and going and there's no limit to this. This person can't be included in any kind of environmental coalition because they don't even seem to agree with the basic aims and like sets of goals we have in common that root this coalition.
Somebody that walks into the room with an agenda of flying passenger planes into tall buildings gets escorted somewhere else. That's true. But otherwise, if the person is willing to talk and isn't imposing their agenda on other people, you try. You try. And it's remarkable how people sometimes change their minds. Not always. And you're right. I mean, that's the downside of what I just proposed. If you think about it in terms of how can pluralistic democracy work when we don't have a common concept of the good? Because it's part of pluralistic democracy that you're protected to have your own notion of the good. It doesn't have to be what other people have. And yeah, there's limits. And there's some things that you cannot solve. That's why Rawls is wrong about neutral public reason. But that doesn't mean that talk can't be, you can't find some solutions to things. It's just a rolling set of compromises. And your question is kind of asking for, me to set a bright line limit. And what I just said basically was that approach doesn't work.
It seems that there's a difference between the kind of like, this is the only one. I will restrain myself then. The difference between the kind of like dialogue between opposition forces, because it seems like if I think about just the practice of democracy, at least as I think today, there's going to be disagreements that are still around before a decision is come to, not before, after, I'm sorry. So I'm going to have to make a decision, undergo some action before I have everyone in agreement about what to do. And then it seems to me that we have this kind of like, we at times have these rolling compromises, and at times we just have things where I might just want to, in some kind of interest of the majority, just be a little bit brutal almost in just pushing out certain people who just aren't with the program yet. Which seems, kind of a little scary within the view you've described.
I spent most of this talk talking about some horribly neglected groups of people who have suffered horrible things because folks in power just had to make decisions and didn't include them in the decisions. That doesn't have to happen. Of course, you can't keep talking about the thing forever. You have to make decisions sometimes. And all sorts of factors force you to make decisions sometimes. But you can approach things in a way that is participatory and collaborative and recognizes who needs to be at the table, and you can approach things in a way that doesn't. Since I skipped along, I missed the end of my last slide, which was simply to point out a conference that I was at recently called by a group called POWER, which is mainly African-American led, and it's an environmental justice society group in Philadelphia. And they called all the environmental groups in Philadelphia together just to talk about these issues and to see where we got. That's the kind of thing that has to happen a lot. And then our decision making will change. We'll still be up against the gun sometimes, but it'll be different. And that's the best I can say to that question, I think.
So you talked about how general justice refers to You talked about what general justice refers to as being doing what's right. and special justice referring to doing what's fair. Can you clarify the difference between doing what's right and doing what's fair?
Yes. Aristotle talks about, there's these, general justice just means doing the right thing. That is to say, it covers everything, all of ethics. If you're just, then, and you're benevolent, and you're fair, and you're loving, and you're you keep your promises, and so on and so on and so on and so on. It's the New Testament word righteousness, dikaiosune. That's Greek, and the Greek word dike, means justice. It's just general. Then there's this special notion, much more focused, of fairness, right? Of accountability, of respecting rights and things like that. And that's one piece of ethics. It's not the whole business. It's not love, for example. You can talk about justice and mercy and the dialectic between them and that kind of thing. Does that help? Yeah. Good.
I was really confused on how I was going to word this question. So I'm going to do my best. If you need me to clarify, just ask me. So we talked about environmental responsibility in the beginning of the talk. Yeah. And you didn't really take one side on this. Are we responsible as all individuals, as organisms of the planet, for the environment? And I'm personally, I lean toward yes. And if that's the case, then is there a general lack of responsibility right now in the powers that be?
Yes, but it's complicated, and that's right at the center of what my book is about, because, and I'll do it with responsibility. In the book, I'm doing it with character, which is a bigger concept and broader, but responsibility is easier. You can talk about individual responsibility, where, I did this, I should pay the price, or I did this, I should get the credit, right? And you can talk about shared responsibility, where, maybe there would be something happening right here, somebody needed help, and several of us gathered together to help. And each of us made our individual contribution. We couldn't have done it if we didn't do it together. But it's still, you can distribute the responsibility and the credit or the blame to all the individuals without remainder. That's easy enough to reconcile with our innate individualism in the West. But it doesn't cover all the territory. Because if you say, who is dropping drones in Pakistan? Well, it's the United States. It's not just that service person in the little silo somewhere in Colorado pressing the button. It's not just the spotter who's, keeping the cameras going to find out the target. It's not just the president or the general, whoever is authorizing the strike. It's not all them together. It's the country. And then the question is, what responsibility do you and I have for that? And when our country does something good, we are proud. When our sports team does, we're proud. We feel excited. When we do something bad, we feel ashamed. But what's the connection? And here's what I want to say about it. And I get a lot of this from Larry May, who's a philosopher, who talks about the morality of groups. What I want to say is that there's nothing, groups are just us in relationship. They don't have any separate existence apart from us. So nobody else is doing it but us. We're doing it. But those relationships extend across generations. They go underground into our subconscious. Our very selves, our social selves, we're always on stage inside ourselves before theoretical others. And it gets impossible to track the responsibility for collective actions, all of it, back to each individual without remainder. And so collective responsibility and collective character is the responsibility for actions that we do collectively that's left over. You can't distribute to all the individuals, but it's structural, right? And it's sort of like this, that, you have to grow out of racism. You have to grow out of prejudice of various kinds. You grow up into it without knowing it, and then it shows up, and you start changing your mind, and now you've got to deal with it and somehow get rid of it. Okay? But the whole society is producing people like this, racists, consumers, lovers of nature, whatever. That make sense a little bit? I mean, I can point you to stuff to read. It's a hard question, and I hope I did a decent job of explaining what I think about it, but there's a lot of different views.
Okay, so I'm going to go with...
So, David, I guess my question is tied to this, and then the first question too. I can totally get on board with the idea of intersubjective agreement, of free discourse, for those who are similarly interested in trying to do something towards environment. I guess my concern is that, I think also within the last few decades, it's become more and more clear how common sociopathy is. How many individuals within society, in fact, don't have this notion of respect for the other at such a basic level that their decision-making doesn't take the other or the other's needs into account, that their interest is deeply tied towards what is good for them in the short term, everything be damned. And that'd be one thing if we could just say, well, we're going to kick the people who are flying planes into buildings out of our group. But these same people, and I think tied to these very traits, become extremely powerful by making use of the power structures within our society.
They get elected president.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And tied to this, their power. I'm with you that we shouldn't. It would be wrong to say that all these folks are necessarily also then racist. For instance, they can still produce this institutionalized racism that you're discussing, without themselves trying to specifically hurt black people or something like that. But what I don't know how to address in terms of your approach here is if we're talking about a group of very powerful people who actually hold the means of either making or breaking any sort of environmental change. I'm thinking of your own example of, was it Niger and Shell oil companies?
Yeah, and the government.
It's pretty clear in a case like that, this isn't a free and rational discourse kind of solution. They've already gone against free and rational discourse in their actions. So my question is, with this power structure of the world that we're dealing with, how can we not just come to an agreement among environmentalists, but actually do something to fight against those who have no interest in environmentalism?
Yeah. I worry about that, of course. And as I think about, the 23rd Conference of the Parties in Bonn, I also think about, all of the folks engaged in terrorist attacks, right? And all I can say is there are societies that from time to time have run pretty well, decently. There have always been sociopaths, and there's always been abuses, and any society, I think, is fragile in that respect. But I'm not willing to give up hope. And I think that, you look at the United States, how many people vote on average in any election, even a presidential one? 60 is high, isn't it? So many of us have just given up. And I'm with Naomi Klein. When you find people that don't give up, including the environmental justice folks, They have accomplished a lot. They have really changed some things. And now they're really upset because it looks like all those gains are going to be turned back again. But they're not going to stop fighting. I think communities that are really engaged tend to manage the sociopaths instead of electing them president. That's what I think.
I think my fear is that there's a point at which compromise is not enough. And I think it gets back, I mean, I totally agree with Wilson. I think there's this huge evolutionary baggage of in-group, out-group. And I think it's much easier for me to compromise with somebody there in front of me, right? So I think I'm always much more hopeful in terms of, from the environmental racist standpoint, right? It's like, I can deal with people that are there in front of me and I can see how this is unjust. But it's like, I think I have a harder time wrapping my head around 100 years from now or 5,000 years from now or
we
whatever,
all do,
right?
yeah.
Right, which I think is understandable, right? So I think the issue is, okay, even if I get everybody on a relatively even playing field here and now, it may not be enough, right, in that sense, right? And that there comes a point at which, and here's the ecologist in me, right, which is saying, you know, you push things to a point at which the equilibrium state that you're in changes, in some sense, almost irreversibly and very quickly, right? And so that you say, we're all good right now. Is everybody good? We're all good. We feel good. Everybody happy. We're on the same playing field. Yeah, great. That's still not where the people 500 years from now need it to be, because we're doing irreversible damage, right? And that that switch flips.
It has to
in such a way,
be
right,
scientifically accountable. Absolutely
right.
has to be.
And I think then I guess the point ultimately I'm trying to make is that there does come a point at which people's willingness to compromise on things is not enough, and it becomes an issue of it gets legislated. It has to get legislated or it doesn't get done, right? And that, I think, is a very different, to me, it sounds like a very different position, I think, from where you're coming from. But maybe I'm wrong.
I didn't talk much about, the fact that it needs to be legislated. But of course, you're right about that. And there's a dialectic between what happens at the grassroots individually and in groups together, particularly in dialogue between folks who aren't all on the same page to begin with, and what happens at the highest levels, and you have to have both. I belong to an organization called the Citizens Climate Lobby that lobbies Congress twice every year now. Last June, there were like 900 people on the Hill in teams of 5 lobbying practically every congressional office to put a rising price on carbon and give all the money back to households on a monthly basis, which would legislatively shift the economy in the way it needs to go without messing around with regulations. I think it's a pretty good plan. I'm also, when I retire at the end of next semester, going to join that group, Power, and see what they want me to do and how I can be helpful to them, and follow their leadership. That's the grassroots that needs to happen. The Citizens Climate Lobby is both grassroots, but also dealing with legislation. Yeah, you have to. Of course, you have to. And then there's going to be laws, and some people are going to be fined or imprisoned or in other ways penalized for breaking them. Yeah, I mean, you don't have society without something like that. That's true. But what is the decision-making process? That's what I'm talking about. Is it inclusive and participatory, or is it not? At this university, it's not. And you know the consequences of that as well as I do. It's a waste. There's so many good resources here ready to be offered that aren't getting used as they should. On the other hand, if you just let us all go and didn't have any structure, that would work even worse, probably.
So if I could say 2 different things, I will. So when you were talking about the environmental racism movement, environmental justice, I thought of something that might be sort of interesting to include in this. There's a book that was just published this year by Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law, how our government, it's something like The Secret History of How Our Government Segregated America. And there's a wonderful interview with him on Fresh Air from, I think, February this last year. And he talks about how we tend to believe that segregation was a result of culture or, some kind of economic invisible hand. But he details pretty conclusively that this was due to a lot of federal housing policy that made it so that black people couldn't buy in certain areas. If you were to sell your house to somebody who was black, it wouldn't go through. And so it effectively made black people much poorer and also segregated them. And if you don't have segregation, you don't have nearly the capacity for environmental racism of the kind that you were talking about. So I think that might be an interesting part, at least for the American picture to look at.
That very, very definitely, and thank you for the reference. I'll pick it up. But yeah, redlining at every level, from realtors up to the federal government, has really made a mess of things. Yeah. And once it's happened, then it's very hard to recover from it.
Yeah. And then the other point I wanted to make is completely different, and it relates to what Mike was saying. You were talking about values and coming to a shared place of values with people. And I tend to think about this a little differently, that, science is our sort of canon for good information and facts. When our country was founded and the Constitution was written, science was not this big social enterprise that it is now, funded as it is now. And it seems to me there really aren't places within our governmental structure where scientific fact and research is held as a tribunal for what people do. It's something like a lobby, or it's a science advisor who's appointed by the president and might not know anything about any science, which has usually been the case. And so I tend to think that what would be needed, if we were to survive as a species, is to have the best facts, the experts about what is actually destructive to our environment, having some position of authority and not getting in there through all these indirect means or talking about values and things like that. I mean, you could situate the discussion that way, but I think it's not a helpful way to understand what exactly the problem is and why these things may not work and why we'll probably all be dead and gone as a species within the next century. Not due to environmental problems, but because we'll blow ourselves up almost certainly. But anyway, so
we very well may. On the second point that you made there, I do have something to say. And I first of all, I agree with you that there should be a much more robust incorporation of scientific expertise in the government, so that it would be impossible for laws to be passed or regulations to be promulgated without going through that screen. But it would be very hard to accomplish, because unless you're going to give the scientists the authority to run the country, the Congress and the president would still have the authority to ride past them if they do. And I think that in the past, there's been quite a bit of, well, it has varied with administration, but NOAA and NASA and other such organizations really have had quite an influence on policy. I think it should be more robust. But in the end, science can tell us what's going on, but they can't tell us what to do or why to do it. And that's where the values come in. And what I'm proposing is not coming to some synthesis of values where we all share them, but rather respecting the different value systems that exist and recognizing that if we're not all trying to convert each other or steamroll each other, we actually have many ways of collaborating. In the book, I've got one of my environmental virtues is biophilia. I borrowed the notion from E.O. Wilson and then try to develop it into an environmental virtue. And in that chapter, one of the things I do is to say, what the biophilia of a Buddhist, an evangelical Christian, Starhawk, a secular humanist, and a couple of other choices would look like. And to show how in the structure of the virtue, they really would be different to a certain degree, and yet they could work together very well in a lab or in some sort of attempt to preserve biodiversity in a particular biome, because they end up in a similar place. And in that way, I think you can say that a pluralistic democracy could still have virtues.
That's that guy. It's over, and so I need to call this to a halt because somebody else needs the room. But I would like to thank Dr. Clowney, and
Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming.